Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing chapters 8 and 9 of Burton Watson's translation of the Vimalakirti Sutra. The Vimalakirti Sutra is also often called the Vimalakirti Nirdesa, which roughly translates to the instruction of Vimalakirti. Nirdesas are not sutras, and as such, it is frequently argued that the Vimalakirti Sutra or the Vimalakirti Nirdesa was not originally a canonical sermon of the Buddha, but it is read, recited, and studied like one. In fact, it is one of the most important Mahayana sutras out there, and definitely one of my favorites. Important themes in the sutra include non-dualism, emptiness, the illusoriness of things in the world, and the superiority of the Bodhisattva path and the Mahayana path over the other paths. Chapter 8 focuses specifically on the nature of the Bodhisattva path and how one ought go about it, and Chapter 9 focuses on the nature of non-duality. Specifically, you'll see that Vimalakirti engages in a very different kind of narrative with the Bodhisattva path, as opposed to other famous sutras. And in Chapter 9, you'll see that he engages in a friendly contest with other disciples of the Buddha to see who can most succinctly and correctly explain the meaning of non-duality. This contest between Vimalakirti and the assembled bodhisattvas results in a very fascinating and famous scene, as you will see. The text was likely composed in Sanskrit in or around the 2nd century CE, and Burton Watson's translation is of Kumarajiva's classical Chinese translation of the text. We hope you enjoy. At that time, Manjushri asked Vimalakirti, "How does the Bodhisattva go about mastering the Buddha way?" Vimalakirti said, "The Bodhisattva should follow a path that is not the way, then he can master the Buddha way." Manjushri asked, "How does a Bodhisattva follow a path that is not the way?" Vimalakirti replied, "If the Bodhisattva goes to the region of the 5 sins that lead to the hell of incessant suffering, he shows no anguish or anger. He arrives in hell, but is free of offense or defilement. He arrives in the realm of beasts, but without the faults of stupidity or arrogance. He arrives in the realm of the hungry spirits, yet is fully endowed with merits. He goes to the world of form and the world of formlessness, but makes no boast of this. He shows greed and desire in his actions, yet is removed from the stains of attachment. He shows anger in his actions, yet has no anger or aversion toward living beings. He appears to be stupid, but utilizes wisdom to regulate his mind. He appears stingy and grasping, yet relinquishes both inner and outer possessions, begrudging neither body nor life. He appears to break the commandments, but in fact resides secure in the pure precepts, and even then remains fearful of committing the smallest fault. He seems angry and irascible, yet is at all times compassionate and forbearing. He seems indolent and lazy, yet works diligently to acquire merit. He seems disordered in thought, yet constantly practices meditation. He seems stupid, yet has mastered both worldly and otherworldly wisdom. He appears fawning and deceitful, but is skilled in expedient means and faithful to the sutra doctrines. He appears haughty and arrogant, yet serves as a bridge and a crossing for living beings. He appears to be immersed in earthly desires, but his mind is at all times clear and pure. We see him going among devils, yet he abides by the Buddha wisdom and heeds no other teachings. We see him going among voice-hearers, but to living beings he preaches a law never heard before. We see him going among Pratyekya Buddhas, but he manifests great pity in teaching and converting living beings. He seems to be among the poor and destitute, yet he has jeweled hands capable of bestowing inexhaustible benefits. He seems to be crippled and deformed, yet possesses auspicious features, adorning himself wonderfully with them. He seems to be humble and lowly, yet is born into the seed and lineage of the Buddha, fully endowed with blessings. He seems to be among the puny and emaciated, the ugly and vile, yet acquires the body of Narayana, a delight for all beings to see. He seems to be old and ailing, yet has forever cut off the roots of illness and transcended the fear of death. He appears to possess wealth, but habitually regards it as transient and in fact covets none of it. He seems to have wives, concubines, and waiting women, yet never sullies himself in the bog of the 5 desires. He seems thick-tongued and clumsy in speech, yet commands great eloquence and retains all he has learned, forgetting nothing. Though appearing to employ unorthodox methods of salvation, he follows the correct teaching in saving living beings. He appears to enter all the different paths of existence, yet cuts himself off from their influence. He appears to have entered nirvana, yet never cuts himself off from the realm of birth and death. Manjushri, by going to places that are the opposite of the way in this fashion, the Bodhisattva is able to master the Buddha way. Vimalakirti then asked Manjushri, "What may act as the seeds of the thus come one?" Manjushri said, "The body is the seed. Ignorance and partiality are the seeds. Greed, anger, and stupidity are the seeds. The 4 topsy-turvy views are the seeds. The 5 obscurations are the seeds. The 6 sense media are the seeds. The 7 abodes of consciousness are the seeds. The 8 errors are the seeds. The 9 sources of anxiety are the seeds. The 10 evil actions are the seeds. To sum it up, the 62 erroneous views and all the different kinds of earthly desires are all the seeds of the Buddha." "What do you mean by that?" Manjushri replied, "A person who has perceived the uncreated nature of reality and entered into correct understanding cannot again set his mind on attaining Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. The lotus does not grow in the upland plain. The lotus grows in the mud and mire of a damp, low-lying place. In the same way, the Buddha law can never grow in a person who has perceived the uncreated nature of reality and entered into correct understanding. It is only when living beings are in the midst of the mire of earthly desires that they can turn to the Buddha law. If you plant seeds in the sky, they will never grow. Only when you plant them in well-manured soil can they sprout and flourish. In the same way, the Buddha law will never grow in a person who has perceived the uncreated nature of reality and entered into correct understanding. But one who entertains egoistic views as huge as Mount Sumeru can still set his mind on the attainment of Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. From this, you should understand that all the various earthly desires are the seeds of the Thus Come One. If you do not descend into the vast ocean, you can never acquire a priceless pearl. In the same way, if you do not enter the great sea of earthly desires, you can never acquire the treasure of comprehensive wisdom." At that time, Mahakashapa sighed and said, "Excellent, excellent, Manjushri. These words are aptly spoken. It is indeed just as you say. Those who are troubled by the passions are the seeds of the Thus Come One. But persons such as us, the voice hearers, are now no longer capable of setting our minds on the attainment of Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. Even those who have committed the 5 sins that lead to the hell of incessant suffering can still rouse aspirations that will afford growth to the Buddha law. But now we can never rouse such aspirations. We are like persons whose faculties are impaired and can no longer satisfy the 5 desires. The voice hearers, who have cut off all entanglements, are like this, for they can no longer benefit from the Buddha law, nor will they ever have the desire to. In this sense, Manjushri, the common mortal responds with gratitude to the Buddha law, but the voice hearer does not. Why do I say this? Because when a common mortal hears the Buddha law, he can set his mind on attaining the unsurpassed way, determined that the 3 treasures shall never perish. But the voice hearer may hear of the Buddha's law and powers and fearlessness to the end of his life and yet never be capable of rousing in himself an aspiration for the unsurpassed way. At that time, there was in the assembly a bodhisattva named Universally Manifested Physical Body, who asked Vimalakirti, "Layman, your father and mother, wife and children, relatives, retainers, clerks, people, and friends, who are they? Your maids and menservants, your elephants, horses, and carriages, where are they?" Vimalakirti replied with the following verses. "Wisdom is the bodhisattva's mother. Expedient means his father. Of those who guide and teach all beings, there are none not born of these. Dharma joy is his wife. Pity and compassion of mind are his daughters. The good mind and sincerity his sons. Final emptiness and tranquility his dwelling. For disciples, he has the many dusts and passions. They follow the dictates of his will. The 37 elements of the way are his good friends. Through them he gains correct enlightenment. The paramitas are his dharma companions. The 4 methods of winning others, his singing girls. For songs they carol the words of the dharma, such is the music made for him. In the garden of full retention of the teachings grow the trees of the law free from outflows. Their wonderful blossoms are the 7 factors of enlightenment, their fruit, emancipation, and wisdom. On the bathing pool of the 8 emancipations, brimming with clear waters of meditation, spread the lotuses of 7 purities. Those who bathe there are spotless. His elephants and horses race the 5 roads of transcendental power. For chariot he has the great vehicle. Controlling, directing with a single mind, he travels the 8-fold path. His form displays all the auspicious marks. Every good feature adorns him. He is clothed in the garments of shame and remorse, a deeply searching mind his garland. For wealth he has the treasure of the 7 assets, which he teaches to others, enriching them. He practices as the teachings direct, his great profits he shares with others. His couch is the 4 meditations, where the pure way of life is born. He hears much, augmenting his wisdom, sounding the call of self-awakening. The sweet dew of the law is his food, sauced with the flavor of emancipation. He bathes in purification of the mind, anointing himself with the perfume of the precepts. He wipes out the thieves of earthly desire. His valor cannot be outshone. He conquers and subdues the 4 kinds of devils. His victory banners fly over the place of practice. Though he knows there is no arising or extinction, he undergoes birth so that he may instruct others. In every land he manifests himself. Like the sun, nowhere is he not seen. To the countless millions of thus come ones of the 10 directions he gives alms, yet he never thinks of these Buddhas as in any way separate from himself. Though he knows that the Buddha lands, along with living beings, are empty, yet constantly he works to purify the lands, teaching and converting the many beings. The form and voice and behavior of every manner of living being, the Bodhisattva with his fearless powers can take on any of these in an instant. He understands all devilish affairs and can imitate the actions of devils. Wise in the skillful use of expedient means, he can manifest all such forms at will. At times he shows himself old, sick, and dying, in order to waken living beings, so they will realize they are like conjured phantoms and gain understanding, free of all obstacles. However, he shows the kalpa ending in flames, heaven and earth consumed with all else, so that people who think of things as permanent will clearly perceive their impermanence. Countless billions of living beings come in company to visit the Bodhisattva, all arriving at his house at the same moment. He converts them, directs them to the Buddha way. Secular writings, secret spells and incantations, crafts, skills, the many arts, all of these he shows himself adept in, so he may aid and benefit living beings. He becomes a monk in all the different creeds of the world, so that thereby he may free others from delusion and save them from falling into erroneous beliefs. At times he becomes the sun, the moon, a heavenly being, an Indra, a Brahma, lord of the world. At others he may become earth or water, or again become wind or fire. If during the kalpa there is pestilence, he manifests himself as medicinal herbs. Those who drink potions made from them will be healed of sickness, cleansed of all poison. If during the kalpa there is famine, he manifests his body as food and drink, first relieving hunger and thirst, then telling people of the law. If during the kalpa there is a clash of arms, he accordingly rouses a mind of compassion, converting those living beings, causing them to dwell in a land without contention. When great armies confront each other in the field, he causes them to be of equal might, manifesting his bodhisattva power and authority, subduing them and restoring peace. In whatever country hells exist, at once he sets out, journeys there, striving to relieve their sufferings. In whatever country beasts are devouring one another, in all his births he manifests himself there, so he can bring aid to those lands. He shows himself subject to the 5 desires, yet is also seen to practice meditation, causing the devil's minds to be dazed and confounded, so they cannot take advantage of others. To live as a lotus among flames, this may be deemed a rare thing. To exist amid desire, yet practice meditation, this too is rare. Sometimes he shows himself as a woman of pleasure, enticing those prone to lechery. First he catches them with the hook of desire, then leads them into the Buddha way. Sometimes he appears as a village headman, other times as leader of the merchants, as a teacher of the nation, a high-placed official, abetting and profiting all beings. Where there are those in poverty and want, he shows himself with limitless stores, using them to encourage and lead others, causing them to set their minds on attaining Bodhi. Among those arrogant and full of ego, he becomes a man of great strength, overpowering and curbing their haughtiness, causing them to dwell in the unsurpassed way. Where there are those timid and qualing, he stands at their head to lend assurance. First he fills them with fearlessness, then causes them to set their minds on the way. Sometimes he is seen renouncing lust and desire, to become a holy man of the 5 transcendental powers, opening the way, guiding living beings, causing them to dwell in the precepts, forbearance, and compassion. If there are those looking for servants, he shows them a groom or menial, and after delighting his employers, he rouses in them a mind for the way. Whatever others are looking for, he supplies it to win them to the Buddha way. With his skill and the power of expedient means, he can satisfy all their wants. Thus his ways are beyond measure, his practices know no bounds. Infinite in wisdom, he saves and emancipates countless beings. Though all the Buddhas, for numberless billions of kalpas, should praise the merits he achieves, they could never finish doing so. Who can hear of this law and not set his mind on the attainment of Bodhi? Who but the utterly worthless, the blindly ignorant, the witless? At that time, Vimalakirti said to the various bodhisattvas, Sirs, how does the bodhisattva go about entering the gate of non-dualism? Let each one explain as he understands it. One of the bodhisattvas in the assembly, whose name was Dharma Freedom, spoke these words, Sirs, birth and extinction form a dualism, but since all dharmas are not born to begin with, they must now be without extinction. By grasping and learning to accept this truth of birthlessness, one may enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, virtue guardian, said, I and mine form a dualism. Because there is an I, there is also a mine. But if there is no I, there will be no mine. In this way, one enters the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, unblinking, said, perception and non-perception form a dualism. But if dharmas are not perceived, then there is nothing to take hold of. And because there is nothing to take hold of, there will be no grasping, no rejecting, no action, no volition. In this way, one enters the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, virtue peak, said, defilement and purity form a dualism. But if one sees into the true nature of defilement, it is without the marks of purity, but leads into the extinction of all marks. In this way, one enters the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, good constellation, said, the stirring of the mind and thought, these two form a dualism. But if the mind is not stirred, then there will be no thought. And if there is no thought, there will be no discrimination. The one who has thoroughly mastered this may in this way enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, good eye, said, the unique in form and the formless constitute a dualism. But if one understands that the unique in form is in fact the formless, and then does not seize on the formless, but sees all as equal, one may in this way enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, wonderful arm, said, the Bodhisattva mind and the voice-hearer mind constitute a dualism. But if one regards the mind as empty in form, like a conjured phantom, then there is no Bodhisattva mind and no voice-hearer mind. In this way, one may enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, Pushya, said, good and not good form a dualism. But if one does not call up either good or not good, but enters into the realm of the formless and truly masters it, in this way, one may enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, lion, said, blame and blessing form a dualism. But if one penetrates the true nature of blame, it is no different from blessing. When one can dispose of forms with this diamond-like wisdom, neither bound nor liberated, one may in this way enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, lion will, said, presence of outflows of passion and absence of such outflows constitute a dualism. But if one can grasp the fact that all dharmas are equal, then one will not give rise to the concept of outflows or no outflows. One will not be attached to form nor dwell in the formlessness either. In this way, one may enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, pure understanding, said, the created and uncreated form a dualism. But if one does away with all enumerations, then the mind is like empty sky, freed of all obstacles, through pure clean wisdom. In this way, one enters the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, Narayana, said, the worldly and the unworldly form a dualism. But since the nature of the worldly is empty, the worldly is in fact the unworldly, neither entering into it nor going out of it, neither exceeding nor falling short. In this way, one enters the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, good will, said, the realm of birth and death and that of nirvana form a dualism. But if one sees the true nature of birth and death, one sees that there is no birth or death, no binding, no unbinding, no birth, no extinction. One who understands in this way may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, direct seeing, said, the exhaustible and the inexhaustible form a dualism. But whether dharmas are in the end exhaustible or inexhaustible, they are all without the marks of exhaustibility. And if they are without the marks of exhaustibility, they are empty. And if they are empty, they are without the marks either of exhaustibility or inexhaustibility. If one enters this realm of understanding, one may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, universal guardian, said, I and not I form a dualism. But when one cannot grasp even I, how can one grasp not I? One who has seen into the true nature of I will no longer give rise to these two concepts, and in this way enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, lightning god, said, enlightenment and ignorance form a dualism, but the true nature of ignorance is none other than enlightenment. And enlightenment cannot be seized, but is apart from all enumerations. One dwells in the center, in the equality without dualism, and in this way enters the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, joyful seeing, said, form and the emptiness of form constitute a dualism. But form is none other than emptiness. Emptiness does not represent the extinction of form. Form is itself empty by nature. In the same way, perception, conception, volition, and consciousness, and the emptiness of consciousness constitute dualisms. But the consciousness is none other than emptiness. Emptiness does not represent the extinction of consciousness. Consciousness is itself empty by nature. Dwelling in the midst of these concepts and understanding them thoroughly, one may, in this way, enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, enlightened as to form, said, to regard the four elements, earth, water, fire, and wind, as different from the element emptiness or space is dualistic. The nature of the four elements is none other than the nature of emptiness. Just as the past and future of these elements is empty, so too must their present be empty. If one can understand the nature of the elements in this way, one may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Wonderful Will said, the eye and the objects it observes constitute a dualism. But if one understands the nature of the eye, then with regard to objects, one will be without greed, without anger, and without stupidity. This is called tranquil extinction. Similarly, the ear and sounds, the nose and smells, the tongue and tastes, the body and touch, the mind and phenomena constitute dualisms. But if one understands the nature of the mind, then with regard to phenomena, one will be without greed, without anger, and without stupidity. This is called tranquil extinction. Dwelling at rest in its midst, one may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Inexhaustible Will said, almsgiving and applying the merits gained thereby to acquire comprehensive wisdom constitute a dualism. But the nature of almsgiving is none other than the applying of merits to acquire comprehensive wisdom. Similarly, keeping of the precepts, forbearance, assiduousness, meditation, and wisdom form dualisms in contrast to the applying of merit to acquire comprehensive wisdom, etc. But the nature of wisdom is none other than the applying of merits to acquire comprehensive wisdom. By entering into an understanding of the singleness of form that all these share, one may thus enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Deep Wisdom said, this is emptiness, this is formlessness, this is non-action. To speak in this manner is dualistic. Emptiness is none other than formlessness. Formlessness is none other than non-action. If something is empty, formless, non-acting, then it is without mind, will, or consciousness. This single doctrine of emancipation is the same as the threefold doctrine of emancipation, regarding emptiness, formlessness, and non-action. In this way, one enters the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Tranquil Roots said, to speak of the Buddha, the law, and the assembly is dualistic. The Buddha is none other than the law is none other than the assembly. The three treasures are all uncreated in form, like the empty sky, and all dharmas are the same. One who can act in accordance with this understanding may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Mind Unobstructed said, the body and the body extinguished constitute a dualism, but the body is none other than the body extinguished. Why? Because one who sees into the true form of the body does not give rise to thoughts of seeing the body or seeing the extinction of the body. The body and the extinction of the body are not two things, not a distinction to be made. One who rests in this understanding, neither alarmed nor fearful, may in this way enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Superior Goodness said, to speak of the activities of body, mouth, and mind is dualistic. These three activities are all marked by the aspect of non-action. If the body is marked by non-action, then the mouth must be marked by non-action. And if the mouth is marked by non-action, then the mind must be marked by non-action. And since these three activities are marked by non-action, then all dharmas must be marked by non-action. One who can go along with this wisdom of non-action may in this way enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Merit Field said, to speak of meritorious deeds, blameful deeds, and deeds that call forth no retribution is dualistic. The true nature of all three kinds of deeds is empty, and if it is empty, then there are no meritorious deeds, no blameful deeds, and no deeds that call forth no retribution. One who does not rouse any thought of distinctions with regard to these three types of deeds may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Flower Garland said, from the concept of self rises the concept of two things, self and other, which creates a dualism. But one who sees into the true form of the self will not give rise to the thought of the two things. And if one does not dwell in the thought of two things, then one will be without consciousness, and without anything one is conscious of, and in this way may enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Virtue Storehouse said, to suggest that there is some form or object that one can acquire is dualistic. But if one realizes that there is nothing to be acquired, then there will be no grasping and no rejecting. And when there is no grasping and no rejecting, one may in this way enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Moon in Midair said, darkness and light form a dualism. If there is no darkness and no light, there will be no dualism. Why? It is like entering the meditation that wipes out perception and conception, where there is neither darkness nor light. And the forms of all dharmas are the same as this. If one enters this state and views all with equality, one may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva Treasure Sign said, To yearn for nirvana and not delight in the world constitutes a dualism. But if one does not yearn for nirvana and does not loathe the world, there will be no dualism. Why? If there is binding, there will be unbinding. But if there is no binding to begin with, who will seek to be unbound? And where there is no binding and unbinding, there will be no yearning and no loathing, and in this way, one may enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, jewel-crowned king, said, "The correct way and the erroneous way constitutes a dualism. But one who dwells in the correct way does not make distinctions, saying, 'This is erroneous,' or 'This is correct,' and by removing oneself from both, one may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. The Bodhisattva, delight in truth, said, 'The true and the not true form a dualism. But one who sees truly cannot even see the true, so how can he see the untrue? Why? Because they cannot be seen by the physical eye. Only the eye of wisdom can see them. But for this eye of wisdom there is no seeing and no not seeing. In this way, one may enter the gate of non-dualism." When the various bodhisattvas had finished one by one giving their explanations, they asked Manjushri, "How then does the bodhisattva enter the gate of non-dualism?" Manjushri replied, "To my way of thinking, all dharmas are without words, without explanations, without purport, without cognition, removed from all questions and answers. In this way, one may enter the gate of non-dualism." Then Manjushri said to Vimalakirti, "Each of us has given an explanation. Now, sir, it is your turn to speak. How does the bodhisattva enter the gate of non-dualism?" At that time, Vimalakirti remained silent and did not speak a word. Manjushri sighed and said, "Excellent, excellent. Not a word, not a syllable. This truly is to enter the gate of non-dualism." When this chapter on entering the gate of non-dualism was preached, 5,000 bodhisattvas in the assembly were all able to enter the gate of non-dualism and to learn to accept the truth of birthlessness. That was chapter 8 and 9 of the Vimalakirti Sutra. Docs, do you have any questions?
Several. So to start with, let's name our characters. So in chapter 8, the main characters that we're dealing with are Manjushri and Vimalakirti.
Vimalakirti, yeah.
Vimalakirti. So just let's start with a quick review of who these folks are.
Yeah, very good. So Vimalakirti is this very advanced lay practitioner. He doesn't really come up elsewhere in the texts, and yet he's kind of the main character. He's kind of giving this whole sermon in this text. He's this very wealthy guy who has a big house and a big family and a lot of money, and he's not very Buddha-like. He's not very Bodhisattva-like either, at least in the way that we would have understood Bodhisattvahood prior to this text. He likes to drink a lot and go to what we might call dens of iniquity, like brothels and gambling houses and drinking houses. And what we see come out in this chapter is that he's not doing those things because he actually gets some sort of sensory pleasure from them. He's doing these things actually so that he can do secret undercover bodhisattva work there. He's trying to enlighten beings while he's there so that he can drive their attention and their desire away from those things and toward enlightenment. The way that he kind of sets up this whole sermon is something I talk about a little bit in the intro, but I should mention here. Apparently, the sutra begins with the Buddha preaching to his audience, and he tells them that his good friend Vimalakirti has said that he is ill, and the Buddha urges one of his disciples to go and visit him, to call in on him and see how he's doing. And he tries to pressure several different bodhisattvas to do this, and they all actually say no. And the reason they say no is because at some time or the other, Vimalakirti has actually one-upped them or embarrassed them with regard to their own practice. He's explained meditation to them way better than they could ever have done. He explains non-duality or emptiness better than they could have done. And these disciples eventually, they really don't want to go because they're insecure about Vimalakirti and how advanced he is for being a lay practitioner. And so eventually Manjushri finally says he's going to go, and that's how we start having this whole sermon. But he's a very interesting character because he's kind of like a playboy bodhisattva. He doesn't do any of the average Buddhist stuff that we might think of prior to this text. He's not monastic in any sense of the word. He doesn't seclude himself from the world. He doesn't study super hard. He doesn't practice super hard. He actually just lives out in the world exactly as it is. And he's a householder, and he has a family, and he has a lot of sex, and he drinks a lot, and he gambles. And the reason he's doing that, like I said, is to slowly but surely enlighten these beings.
And that kind of is where the story starts, is just talking about how does the Bodhisattva go about mastering the Buddha way is the first question. And the way Vimalakirti answers that is basically, don't do the Buddha way. Like, it's go into where the suffering is, and the way Vimalakirti's doing it is engaging in it and being part of it and trying to lead the way out from inside, whereas the more typical Bodhisattva way would be a lot less entwined in it, I think. And other sutras, whenever bodhisattvas have come up as characters, they tend to feel disconnected. And that's because part of being a bodhisattva is having no attachments. So they're kind of floating outside of the real world in a way, like they're not fully in there. Whereas Vimalakirti is saying, in order to make the step from bodhisattva to Buddha, you have to go in there and do it.
Yes, and that actually makes a lot of sense, because if we imagine bodhisattvas whose entire goal is to save all sentient beings in the world as being outside of the world in some sense, of course they're not outside the world in the sense that they're born on Earth and they live on Earth and they eat food and they breathe air and such things. If we imagine them as being outside of the conventional day-to-day world of our experiences, then their work is misdirected. They need to be where we are in order to save us. That's the idea here. Now, that's one point of view. Of course, other schools of Buddhism regard the Bodhisattva path differently, and even other sutras regard the Bodhisattva path differently. But in this case, Vimalakirti is answering kind of a serious and legitimate problem, which is, if we run away from attachments, how do we actually do right by the one single attachment that we still have tying us to samsara, and that is the salvation of all sentient beings? So this is a very interesting solution to that problem, and an interesting reimagination of what a bodhisattva ought to do. Because, for example, in the Lotus Sutra, they have a very different conception of how the bodhisattva ought to live. The bodhisattva should actually stay away from all of these desirous things, and when they go to teach people in cities or in crowded places, they should bring with them a buddy who makes sure that they don't get carried away by desire, and all of these other things that we just don't seem to attribute to bodhisattvas in this text, and things that might have been more conventional prior to this text. And so I really like this one because it's controversial in that way. It reimagines what everyone ought to be doing and how they ought to be doing it in a way that really does drive right against some other texts that exist in the canon.
Yeah, it also, we've already talked about upaya and the problems that come from that kind of approach extensively, but it's all here too. Like, all of the problems that I've pointed out in the past about why upaya makes me nervous is also here. This reimagining of the bodhisattva path opens the way for excusing terrible behavior. And Vimalakirti's answer to that observation would be, right, but I'm not doing it with attachment. And the problem there is that all of that is in his head. Like, an enlightened person would be able to, look at Vimalakirti and be like, oh yeah, he's legitimate. He's actually doing this and is trying to master the Buddha way. But I'm not enlightened. And so if I were looking at Vimalakirti, I would just see a hedonist. And so, I guess the question that comes to mind would be, is there any advice for recognizing this type of bodhisattva behavior? Or is this just a matter of, how does that work? What is there a way to perceive between a bodhisattva in the world doing their work and just an asshole who's doing things that they like?
The question that you bring up is very important, and the problem that you bring up is equally important. And I think that if I were to read in between the lines about each of the bodhisattvas of the Buddha who refuse to go and look in on Vimalakirti whenever the Buddha tells them that he's sick and wants a visitor, I think that they also feel the same way. They feel like somehow he schooled me, and yet he's doing all of these things which we are taught are horrible, which we are not practicing, which we're avoiding because they cause desire and suffering, or they are a result of desire and suffering. And so they're kind of anxious about that themselves. I think that they say that Vimalakirti, though he is schooling them on these various things, and that's one chip on their ego, the other chip is that he's doing things that they're uncomfortable with. He's a kind of person that would make them uncomfortable, and they don't like that. So in terms of being a character within the story and being able to tell one way or the other who is and who isn't true, who is legit and who is not, I don't really think that if you are an unenlightened being, there is any real verifiable way to tell. But the fact that there is no way to tell, I think, is part of the important part of the story. I think that it factors into how we ought to act and how we ought to understand people and how we ought to judge or not judge their behaviors. So knowing fully well that the person who reads this and that the person who lives in the world who is unenlightened would not be able to tell the difference means that they should treat someone who does those things as they would a bodhisattva. They should be respectful, they should be generous, they should be reverent, and all of these other things. They should not imagine that that kind of person, just because they're doing those kinds of things, is not someone who knows something about something, right? I think that whenever we get attached to these hard set moralistic standards that the Pali Canon sets up and that other religious traditions set up, which basically say, don't do this thing because don't do this thing. When we get too attached to that, it makes it so that people have the weapons with which to say, okay, I'm morally superior because I don't do the thing and other person does the thing. And because they do the thing, they are morally inferior. This text, I think, is trying to question that judgment and make you rethink how you're going to perceive people like that before you come to those kinds of conclusions. I think that what it's trying to urge the reader to do, specifically with regards to these chapters, there's other motivations and other urges I can see in other chapters, but with this chapter specifically, I think it's urging the reader to look upon all sentient beings as though you may or may not be looking at a hidden bodhisattva.
And that's an interesting way to look at it, but it also makes resisting any kind of ill will impossible. Because you can't tell if you're looking at a hidden bodhisattva or an asshole. If you have to treat everyone like a possible bodhisattva, then you're never going to stand up for yourself. Like that requires deference to everything and everyone, and that puts you at the bottom. I don't see how that is at all tenable. The mindset that comes up with, evil becomes impossible, and therefore, not necessarily impossible, but impossible to tell from a bodhisattva's actions. And at that point, how can you resist evil when you can't even name it?
See, I think that in this case, what this text wants us to do is rethink what we consider evil and understand something about bodhisattvas, which is that they are able to use skillful means to create causes and conditions which are specific to the needs and capacities of the people who they are teaching, whether they're hidden or not. So all of Buddhism that we have looked at thus far is essentially teaching positively. Teaching positively means describing a thing by telling someone what it is. And the other side of that would be teaching negatively, which is describing what a thing is by saying what it's not, right? Those are two ways to teach the same thing. I have my opinions about which one is superior, but that's not relevant to this conversation. Now, when it comes to skillful means and teaching in the Buddhist sense, if an individual is enlightened, we have to understand that they can make use of more than just their words to teach. They can make use of their actions, their behaviors. They can make use of psychic powers. They can make use of all of these things that the conventional person who's unenlightened can't make use of. And so, in that regard, because the person is a hidden bodhisattva, then by definition, they're not doing evil. They're doing what is necessary to teach that particular sentient being something that advances them on the path in that moment. So if you witness something that you have decided is evil, this text wants you to consider, is it really evil, or is it the bodhisattva doing bodhisattva work? It's questioning conventional morality in that sense. Now, in the case where something is done unto you, where you might be the unwitting victim of such teaching, right? Let's say that you are at this gambling house and a hidden bodhisattva, who you don't know whether he is one or not, takes you for all you're worth, and you just have to take it, right? What this text wants you to do is not lay down and take it and be screwed by whoever wants to come around and screw you. What this text wants you to do is question your attachment to the money that you lost. It wants you to question your view of a self as possessing anything, as being able to possess anything. It wants you to question the existence of a financial status, of a soul, of a self, of giving and taking, and things like that, right? Now, I should mention, in this text specifically, we don't see any examples of outright evil being used as a teaching tool. We do see that in other texts. In Lotus Sutra, Devadatta gets a whole chapter, and that whole chapter is dedicated to saying how he will one day become a Buddha, a fully realized Buddha. But you'll remember that he is kind of like this Judas character. He tries to kill the Buddha. He tries to create a schism in the community. I'm pretty sure he killed his parents as well. He committed 5 out of 5 of the most heinous sins that a person could commit. And the chapter 12 in the Lotus Sutra tries to demonstrate that even someone as evil as that can get enlightened and become a Buddha in the future, given enough time, as long as they believe the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. That's not really a teaching tool. He's not doing those evil things as a teaching tool. In this text, no one's doing anything as evil as any of those 5 sins. They might be committing sexual indiscretion. They might be consuming intoxicants. They might be lying or cheating or something like that. And these are crimes with victims. That's absolutely true. But it might be not as severe as being killed. It might not be as severe as witnessing somebody kill their parents or try and kill the Buddha or something like that. This is certainly a crime with a victim, right? But it's something that this text wants you to learn from rather than lay down and accept and take. This text doesn't want you to think of bodhisattvas as gods or saints or treat them as such necessarily, because they're just people. They're just sentient beings. They're really enlightened sentient beings, really generous sentient beings, really wise, knowledgeable, and powerful sentient beings, but they're just sentient beings. So we shouldn't treat them as though they are immune from all consequences of all actions, but we should treat all people as though we have something to learn from them, even if they do something to us that we don't like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I get that. Like, the idea of everybody potentially being able to teach you is a potentially useful idea and worth considering. It's just, he talks about what he does. I would like to see him talk about what he expects the people he's teaching to do. Go through the growth that he is attempting to bring out of them. So, like, right here, all I have is his assurance that by, going into the places where suffering is and potentially increasing that suffering, he's teaching people. And as an engineer, I cannot, there's no useful differentiation between that and somebody who's just causing suffering. So I'm sitting here thinking, what do you do about it? And the answer is kind of nothing. That seems to be the answer in a lot of Buddhist questions, is that it comes down to nothing. That's what chapter 9, which we haven't gotten to yet, is kind of saying. It ends on nothing. And so it feels like it is encouraging a very passive way of going about the world, which might be religiously what needs to happen, but in a practical sense and a living in the world sense, I think that's a terrible idea. And I need to see, I'm not seeing what one is supposed to do here. He's talking about what he's doing, and I want to hear about what I'm supposed to be doing, I guess.
No, those are good, valid points. And I'm glad that you bring them up because this is truly the weeds of upaya. This is the weeds of skillful or expedient means. And so we can possibly think about it in the context of the system that Buddhism creates for the world around us. According to the system that Buddhism creates, technically speaking, all sentient beings, hungry ghosts, hell dwellers, animals, humans, gods, and arhats and bodhisattvas and pratyeka buddhas, they're all on the path, whether they know it or not. And karma applies to them as much as it applies to anybody else. And we can't know who is in this world and doesn't know they're a bodhisattva, or who is and they know they are, but no one else knows they are, and so on and so forth. We can't know those things because we're unenlightened. However, what I wanted to mention is that in this system, the idea is that there is a critical amount of suffering that must happen in an individual before they turn to the Buddha Dharma. This is not something that's widely held universally around all of Buddhism, but this is something that is critically important in this text in particular. That's sort of one of the pre-assumptions that goes into it. Now, just because I say there's a critical amount of suffering that must happen for someone to be turned to the Buddha Dharma doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be a certain amount of miserable. It means that they have to have a critical amount of knowledge or experience with the unsatisfactoriness of the sensory world. So that means that you can have enough suffering even if you live a life of luxury and you realize that no amount of money is going to buy you happiness. Something like that. But of course, the other side is true too. No amount of working is going to get rid of the characteristic of reality, which is that something is a little bit off. Something is not quite there for you. No matter how much you work, no matter how much you toil and suffer, things will never be 1000% perfect for you, right? That's the other side of that side. And so on either end and all in between, sentient beings have to have enough of an experience with this suffering in order to be positively turned toward the Buddha Dharma. The same thing applies in teaching. You can only tell somebody what something is not so many times before they ask you, okay, what is it? Before they turn around and start to figure out what the thing is themselves. And so bodhisattvas must teach in both ways to both types of sentient beings, both ones who need to have a certain amount of negative experience versus positive experience in order to at least be turned towards the right questions to ask, which would be, are positive and negative experiences a duality, or are they actually really positive or really negative? Are they permanent? Are they impermanent? Are they empty? What's going on here, right? And so that being the case, I would think that the text wants us to go through those considerations as well. And I think that the text wants us to understand that the entire world around us, everything that happens to us and to everyone around us, can possibly be that tipping off point for us or for them. And so we shouldn't judge, look down on these things that are happening around us. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be generous and helpful. We shouldn't forget that in the midst of all of this stuff, all of the other values that a bodhisattva or that an arhat are supposed to have haven't gone away entirely. You're still supposed to have a nonviolent regard for all sentient beings. You're still not supposed to lie, cheat, steal, kill, or anything like that. You're still supposed to save lives and still supposed to be honest and respectful and still supposed to try and be understanding and see the good in people, right? And so I think that the pre-assumption that you have to have a critical amount of suffering in order to be turned toward the teaching is what we can see if we read between the lines, but it's also a way that we should understand the world around us and everybody in it.
The idea of a critical mass of suffering being necessary explains, at least in the context of the text, that is something that makes a lot of this make more sense. So if you are regarding the world as, a certain amount of suffering is needed in order for enlightenment to occur, in that context, the idea of a bodhisattva increasing suffering makes more sense. I still don't like it. I still am very uncomfortable with the implications on the world that this would have, but I at least understand it at this point.
Yeah, I've had it taught to me before with this metaphor or this story. So like you imagine that you have a foot that's gone necrotic and the necrosis is spreading. And I know that necrosis is very, very painful, of course, but imagine that the pain from necrosis in your mind is less than the pain from amputating the leg. And so you're initially resistant to amputating the leg. And the necrosis has to climb up the foot, the leg, the knee, the thigh, and stuff before you're really open to the idea of chopping off the leg. And so ultimately, because you're hurting now and because you're afraid of the pain of chopping off the leg, the idea of chopping off the leg scares you and gives you more tension and pain and more discomfort than the idea of saving yourself from necrosis, right? So it's kind of like that. You can think of dukkha as being the necrosis, and you can think of cutting off the leg as going over that tipping point to make things better. And you have to suffer a lot, right, before you're able to make that call. You have to get a critical amount of pain from the necrosis before you're willing to accept the amount of pain that comes from chopping off the leg. Because chopping off the leg is ultimately the better thing to do. Even though chopping off the leg is the lesser of two evils, it's still going to prevent you from dying. And so it's not that bad compared to dying of necrosis. So that's kind of the moral calculus, you might say, that bodhisattvas are doing here, right? They see that there is a necrosis. The necrosis is dukkha. It's everywhere. It's everything. And they are trying to make people rethink what it would feel like and how much it would hurt to chop off the leg. Or they're trying to show them that it's bad enough that they have to chop off the leg before it becomes too much, before it's at the point where chopping off the leg is no longer a good idea, is no longer a solution to the problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And, I get that and I understand it. It's just, we've talked about upaya before, and I see no reason to go over it further here. So, second half of chapter 8 kind of goes into a mode of talking about how, I'm looking at, on the text we're reading, it's page 96. But persons such as us, the voice hearers, are now no longer capable of setting our minds on the attainment of Anatara Samyak Sambodhi. So basically, this entire section is it feels from the outside kind of like a bodhisattva pity party, like, hey, we've already heard it, so we can't hear it again. And it sounds like almost a complaint, the way that it's laid out.
So actually, this is a way that the text is condescending to the arhats. Arhats are voice hearers. That's one way that we can translate, not arhat, but their other name, Shravaka, means voice hearer. So whenever they say persons such as us, the voice hearers, are no longer capable of setting our minds on the attainment of Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, it's because they have this lesser capacity for the bodhisattva path as Vimalakirti presents it than other characters in the audience, and ideally the reader too.
Okay. Well, that's a little gross, I guess.
Yeah, because the idea is that especially the arhats and the Shravakas, they are truly the original renunciants, right? There's varying degrees of how much a householder can do this in Mahayana or not do this. But in the Theravada and in the older schools of Buddhism, the only way to make any progress was to renounce all household attachments, all worldly attachments, all familial attachments, and so on and so forth, and retreat somewhere where you could study and meditate and practice on your own. And so because they have committed themselves to that, then they've kind of disqualified themselves from the playboy bodhisattva lifestyle.
Okay. I did not realize that voice hearers was specific to arhats. And it's a little confusing because Manjushri and Vimalakirti are bodhisattvas, right?
That's right.
So are they also arhats? Because they refer to themselves as voice hearers.
Yeah, so in that case, I think that what's going on is that whenever he's saying us, whenever Manjushri says us, when he's talking about voice hearers, I think he's talking about the assemblage, the assembly, the audience who's come to hear him preach. And some of those you might call arhats, right? But it's fascinating because one thing I was going to talk about later on was that in the end, the Buddha gives a prophecy to everybody who went to see Vimalakirti speak. He gives a prophecy that they're going to be reborn as bodhisattvas in Akshobhya's Pure Land. And so whether or not they are bodhisattvas or voice hearers is a little bit confusing. They're kind of in between in this stage. And what it's referring to essentially is just that the idea that you must renounce, the idea that enlightenment or bodhisattvahood or awakening in any sense is an individual aspect that takes place away from the rest of the world is incorrect. And so they've been doing it wrong the whole time.
More of that intersectional sniping that we've complained about before.
Yeah.
And so at the end, we have this in this section in verse that's kind of seems like flowery sort of, poetics for poetic's sake. Like, is there something in this section that I'm missing? It looks more like it's a lot of religious chanting.
Just like in the case of the Lotus Sutra, it's possible that these verse portions were authored before the rest of the text, because you might see that they kind of partially retell what is said in the text. So then the idea is that the text, the prose part, might expound upon the person's interpretation of what's going on in the verse. However, I don't really have any strong proof of that. That's just something that we've seen before. But it's also kind of typical in these contexts for, after a great teaching has been expounded, for somebody to start doing kind of a religious chanting or a verse that they're coming up with on the spot, which is venerating the person who taught it and the thing that they taught. And so it could be both or either.
Okay. Anything else we should talk about in chapter 8?
Nope, I think that takes care of it.
All right. And so chapter 9 is all about non-dualism. In our translation, all of the bodhisattva names are translated into their meanings, but as we've talked about before, I would guess that's not how a native speaker would necessarily engage with it.
Yeah, I don't like it whenever translators do that. I think that it contributes to kind of a misunderstanding of how the names work in the different languages, because, like I've said before, my name, Nicholas, I think that it can be translated from Greek as like victory of the people or something like that, but nobody thinks of victory of the people whenever they think of my name, right? And so it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And from the scholarly perspective, it makes it difficult for me to go on and search who is in the assembly. Those kinds of things are important to me because I need to know, okay, this bodhisattva is here for this sermon. Are they here for another sermon? You can track kind of vaguely, but you can still track the progression of one disciple or the other's advancement through these different texts. And that helps you line them up chronologically, right? That helps you make sense of who authored what and at what time. And in this case, it's virtually impossible to do so. And all it really serves to do is just make the text more flowery and more delightful to read. But it actually takes away some important information, and it causes kind of a problematic misunderstanding of the way that the names themselves work.
So, we just said it's difficult to determine which bodhisattvas are in which assemblies. So is there more to these names other than the names? Like, do we see this same group elsewhere? Or like in past texts, it was more along the lines of these are figures we should praise, but not necessarily characters that pop up elsewhere.
As far as I know, these guys are not elsewhere, but it's, like I said, it's hard to know. And as far as I know, they're not important beyond the fact that they're present and that they hear this teaching and that that's really good for them. In the case of these bodhisattva names, we should mention that these are not birth names that are given to these people. One thing that these special names has done is created a precedent for giving people dharma names or initiation names of some kind. And so let's say that I'm going to become initiated and get myself like a monk name. That's going to be different from my birth name. It's likely going to be from the language of whichever place I would decide to initiate with. And I wouldn't go by that name day by day with just anybody. I might go by that in my community of fellow initiates or whatever, but that's not going to actually be something that a lot of people know. And so that kind of is part of letting go of your own identity. We can think of name, body, and mind as all three participating in creating or constituting what we think of as a self. And whenever we take away that name and give somebody something else, it's doing a little bit of work to kind of get rid of that, break away that identity, and devote you to your practice. There's also been traditions where these names kind of function on an ancestral or lineage-based system where you might share one character in your special monk name with the person who taught you or who taught that person, and so on and so forth. So it's one way to trace lineages, but like I said, translating them really defeats the purpose.
So most of the comments that these bodhisattvas are given are kind of in the form of A and B form a dualism, but A is false, therefore B is false. And that seems to be the common structure for most of these, is just these things are dualism, but if the first part isn't real, then the second part can't be real also, and therefore this way one enters the gate of non-dualism.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll note that they start off kind of granular, and the further that it goes, you might see the scope of the things that they are emptying out by means of creating and collapsing their dualism gets a little bit larger and larger each time.
Until eventually it's like enlightenment or ignorance form a dualism. So enlightenment is also emptied out.
I think that's an interesting dualism to connect to the previous chapter, because that's exactly kind of the experience or the thought process that the text wants you to have. If you look at somebody who does all these playboy bodhisattva things that we've talked about, who goes to dens of iniquity and does stuff like that, you would reach for ignorance, or you would reach for some sort of moral inferiority, right? But the text wants you to transcend this idea that there are people who are ignorant as opposed to those who are enlightened.
I shared a tweet with you once as a joke. The beginning of it was the Buddha saying, there is absolutely no difference between good and bad things. And that was meant as a joke when I sent it, but it's also kind of what's being said here. It's all the same in the end, and it's all empty and non-dual.
Exactly. And I think that pushing non-dualism to its absolute limit is something that we hadn't seen in previous texts, and is something that helps demonstrate this point of emptiness. And it really drives home the fact that these Mahayana texts in particular are questioning these moralities that we've seen come up in the Pali Canon. It thinks that those are dualistic and very easy to get super attached to. And like, while it's true in Mahayana Buddhism that to abstain from killing, abstain from lying, cheating, stealing, abstain from consuming intoxicants, and abstain from sexual indiscretion, while all those things are beneficial for your karma, while they will all make you be in a better standing overall, if you're doing so because of attachment to the result of that action, then you've messed the whole thing up. You're doing it selfishly. And selfishness is exactly what we're trying to get rid of, right? It's the whole root of the problem is selfishness, is thinking that there's a self which can benefit from such things. So it's really pushing non-dualism so that you can push past this attachment to benefits unto oneself for doing good things.
And as we continue, it's a lot more of this same basic structure until we get to Vimalakirti's answer of just silence.
That's right. What is your impression of his response, his silence?
I mean, it's the culmination of a riddle, a play, or something like. We already said, as this list goes on, the scale gets ratcheted up further and further until it's to a point where it gets to a point where it can't escalate any further. And then at that point, it goes back to the simplest answer. So I kind of saw it coming, for one. It's like, oh, I bet at some point someone is going to answer with silence. And it makes sense. Like, I saw it coming because it was adequately telegraphed. So it makes sense in the context of the text. As far as actual meaning to get from it, at least from an unenlightened perspective, there's nothing there to me that I can see, but it's also a good story. So, yeah, more or less how I responded to it.
That's good, yeah. No, and you're pointing to something important, which is that it's a very serious, important scene for how we ought to understand language and its limitations and its uses. And it's also carrying with it the importance of context and how context fits into how we ought to teach and understand and so on, right? we can use words in a billion ways. For example, random fact that I know is that in English, the word set has the most number of definitions out of any other English word. So if I just say the word set, then maybe the person who hears it, their mind reaches for an immediate definition for some reason. And that could almost be like a Rorschach test for them, right? An inkblot test for them. But regardless of that, that one definition is undefined in a moment where there's no context, is what I mean. So the word set, if I don't use it as a verb, or I don't use it as a noun, or anything like that, if it's not attached to any other speaking, it could mean literally anything. Literally anything. It is context which determines its meaning. And I think that that's the perspective of language and silence that's being applied here. The unenlightened person walks around their daily lives and they hear silence all the time. They experience silence all the time. And silence is ultimately, for them, kind of meaningless. Nothing is happening. Nothing's being said. Nothing's being heard. In this case, this silence has a very strong context. We understand when we read this that we're slowly climbing up a mountain which is relative in elevation to the scale of the things that these other bodhisattvas are mentioning, the scale and scope of the non-dualities that they're talking about. And when we finally get to the top and essentially fall off of the mountain, then we get Vimalakirti's silence. It's not just any conventional silence. It's a pregnant silence. It's a silence that carries a lot of meaning with it, at least in the context of the story, because everybody celebrates whenever he says it or when he doesn't say anything. A lot of people have argued that because of the life that this text has in Chan and Zen traditions, that they look down upon language as being not really useful for understanding enlightenment, or at least for getting there. The idea is essentially like this metaphor we've used a lot, the idea that you can't communicate to somebody what chocolate tastes like if you've tasted it and they haven't. They just have to go and taste chocolate if they want to know. In this case, I think that while it's true that you can't explain the taste of chocolate, the silence represents an extremely skillful and an extremely well thought out, premeditated use of silence to, I guess, encourage readers to go out and taste chocolate. So we've talked a lot about how skillful means doesn't just apply to someone's words. It could also apply to their behavior. We talk about how in the beginning of the Lotus Sutra, for example, the Buddha creates like a canopy of umbrellas that covers all 10 realms and stuff, and that everybody who sees it is like super surprised and amazed and delighted and stuff. That's a behavior. And then, of course, he preaches delightful words. It's argued that everything he says all the time, no matter what he says, is delightful to somebody, at least in the audience, because he's the Buddha and that's how he uses language. But also, in this case and in a couple other cases, the use of silence can be equally delightful, equally informative, equally meaningful, given proper context. So in that case, this rhetoric of silence, which comes from the Vimalakirti Sutra, it's interesting because language is not completely useless in that sense. It does point us in the right direction. However, it does include silence as one of the options in the use of language to demonstrate something.
The limitations of language are a perfectly adequate spot to come at this from, because language is limited. There have been many points where I have been looking for a word and have not been able to come up with quite the right thing. Now, I tend to be more picky about my words than I think a lot of folks are, but all the same, language is limited. There are certain things that are just never going to be able to be conveyed through language. And silence, action, and in this case, inaction, can add a lot more that the language itself doesn't include. Like when we're talking about silence, when I'm editing these episodes, I purposefully leave periods of silence where it's necessary, because if I were to cut this down and make things run as quickly as possible for the episode, listeners wouldn't be able to hear what's going on, because we need those silences. We need them to reorient ourselves. We need them to think for a moment about what we just heard. When I'm speaking, I need them to think for a moment about what I'm about to say.
And that's a good practice. It's important linguistically in order to, like you say, in order to keep a proper rhythm and in order to kind of determine how people are going to hear what you have to say.
And different languages are going to have different cadences. The way I'm speaking right now might sound really awkward and weird in Japanese or whatever. So it's the limitations of language. I guess I would say this is a good way to demonstrate the limitations of language and the nuances that come in picking language apart.
Absolutely. And as much as there have been those that argue that this text looks down on language and thus interpolate that Chan and Zen look down on language, I think that thesis is just not strongly supported, because we have this rhetoric of silence in the sutra, which, like we have been saying, argues that silence is skillful use of language in some contexts. But we also have koans, we also have recitation, we also have silent meditation. If language, and therefore silence, are to be looked down upon, then why do we choose one over the other whenever we're sitting in zazen? Well, it goes without saying that language then would be a distractor, or that meaningful silence would also be a distractor, because you're concentrating on something else rather than trying to explore something that your senses are apprehending from the world around you. So I think that we need to interpret this scene not as being entirely critical of language, but as being, like you say, aware of its limitations and aware that silence represents another tool with which we can communicate something to somebody about something. Now that we're at the end of our discussion of chapters 8 and 9, and we were talking a little bit in the beginning about who Vimalakirti is, I just want to mention at the end of this episode, just like at the end of the sutra, it's revealed that Vimalakirti is actually a bodhisattva or a disciple of Akshobhya. And in the end, everybody gets a prophecy that they'll be reborn in Akshobhya's Pure Land. So Vimalakirti was not just like a sick friend or just a lay practitioner. He was actually taking the shape of a lay practitioner and feigning illness, all as a skillful means to encourage these bodhisattvas to come and hear him preach. And allegedly, the Buddha knew about all of this and sent everybody to go and learn from him so that they could reach the level of advancement where they could be reborn in that Pure Land eventually later. I hope that we continue to read and discuss various chapters from this sutra in the future as well, just because there's some very important chapters in here which are very trippy and very, very Mahayana, in the sense that there's characters making use of their special supernatural powers more so than they are actually just saying something. And those are always fun to interpret and discuss here and to read about. And they'll be important too because they will strongly influence East Asian literature and East Asian culture in China, Korea, Japan for centuries, especially in like the medieval period and beyond. And so it's always fun to talk about those as well. Thank you for listening to our reading and discussion of the Vimalakirti Sutra, specifically chapters 8 and 9. We can't wait to read more and discuss more from this sutra and from others. We hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.